The message was already sent before anyone knew something was wrong. In the quiet town of Sebastopol, mornings usually begin without urgency. Tree-lined streets, modest homes, and open stretches of land give the place a rhythm that rarely changes. It's the kind of town where people expect routine, work, family, familiar faces. Nothing about it suggests the start of a crime story. And yet, on April 5, 2024, a different narrative was already unfolding, quietly, invisibly. For 23-year-old Hannah McGuire, life in Sebastopol, Australia was normal. She lived a life that, from the outside, appeared steady. Friends described her as grounded, practical, and emotionally aware. She kept close relationships, especially with her mother. Her communication was consistent. Predictable. That mattered. She spoke to her mum every night before going to sleep. But that night when the messages came, something felt off. Texts were sent from her phone. They suggested distress. Finality. Words that pointed toward a decision already made. To her mother, the tone carried weight, but also confusion. It didn't fully sound like her. Not entirely. Still, there was no immediate reason to assume anything else. In a town like this, explanations tend to follow familiar paths. Emotional strain. Relationship tension. Personal struggles that stay behind closed doors. Nothing public. Nothing loud. But there had been quiet shifts in Hannah's life. Those close to her knew she had been preparing to leave her relationship. Not impulsively, carefully. Plans made, decisions weighed. It wasn't dramatic, but it was final. A transition from one life into another. And transitions create pressure. Financial entanglements don't disappear overnight. Shared spaces carry history. Conversations change tone. What once felt stable begins to fracture, slowly, then all at once. From the outside, none of this was visible. Sebastopol remained calm. The streets unchanged. The houses still. But inside one home, a message had already been sent, one that would shape everything that followed. Because what it suggested, and what had actually happened, were not the same. From the outside, their life followed a pattern that felt ordinary. Hannah McGuire and Lachlan James Young shared a home in Sebastopol. They were a young couple building something that, to neighbors and acquaintances, looked stable. Shared routines. Shared space. The kind of quiet domestic life that rarely draws attention. Hannah worked as a teacher's aide at the Lachlan primary school. She loved working with children, the kind that required patience and emotional presence. She was known to be organized, dependable, and attentive to people around her. Outside of work, her life stayed simple: time with friends, regular contact with family, and small routines that gave her structure. She wasn't someone who disappeared from people's lives without explanation. Her relationship with her mother stood out. They spoke often. Not occasionally, but consistently: calls, messages, check-ins that formed a steady line of communication. It created a pattern. And patterns, when broken, become noticeable immediately. At home, the picture was more complicated. The relationship with Lachlan had begun like many others: shared plans, mutual dependence, a gradual merging of lives. But over time, pressure built beneath that surface. Arguments became more frequent. Tension lingered longer after they ended. There were signs of control. Emotional strain. Moments where the balance between them shifted in ways that weren't always visible to outsiders. Financial pressure added another layer. Shared expenses, obligations, and the practical reality of separating a life that had already been combined. Leaving wasn't just emotional, it required decisions, timing, and risk. And Hannah had started making those decisions. Quietly, but firmly. She was preparing to leave the relationship for good. That decision created a divide inside the same home. One person moving forward. The other facing what that meant. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside, the stability people assumed was already breaking. And once that kind of shift begins, it rarely stays contained. By the months leading up to April 2024, the direction of Hannah McGuire's life had already changed. She was finalizing plans to leave the relationship permanently. The reasons were not sudden. They had built over time, cycles of arguments, instability, and increasing concern about behavior she could no longer ignore. Those close to her were aware that her partner had undergone treatment attempts for drinking and illegal substance abuse. The efforts had not resolved the tension. Instead, conflict continued. There were also patterns of control. Hannah had taken formal steps to protect herself. Before her death, she obtained an intervention order against Lachlan James Young, a legal boundary that reflected how serious the situation had become. It was not a symbolic act. It was documentation of risk. By early April, she was preparing to leave for good. On April 5, 2024, inside the home in Sebastopol, that decision met its final moment. The event occurred in the bathroom. Forensic findings would later confirm the cause of death as strangulation. It required sustained physical force. Close contact. Time. There was no indication of interruption. No evidence that the event extended beyond that confined space. Afterward, the environment remained controlled. Rooms were not disturbed. Objects stayed in place. The house did not reflect a chaotic struggle. It reflected stillness, routine interrupted without explanation. Then came the message. A text was sent from Hannah's phone to her mother. It suggested she intended to take her own life. The wording carried urgency, but something in its tone did not fully align with how she normally communicated. For a moment, the message created a narrative. But the timeline began to fracture quickly. When Hannah failed to respond further, concern escalated. A welfare check was requested. Police were contacted. What began as a message of distress shifted into something else entirely. Inside the home, the scene did not match the explanation. Nothing appeared overtly wrong. And yet, everything was. At first, the explanation seemed to present itself. When police entered the home in Sebastopol, the scene did not immediately suggest homicide. There was no forced entry. No visible struggle extending beyond a single area. No obvious signs of intrusion. And there was the message. The text sent from Hannah McGuire's phone carried weight. It pointed toward distress, toward a decision that could explain everything without requiring anyone else to be involved. For a brief moment, it shaped the initial frame of the investigation. A self-inflicted outcome. Given the known pressures in her life, it did not seem impossible. Relationship strain. Ongoing conflict. The emotional toll of planning to leave. Investigators considered whether those factors could have escalated into a breaking point. Another possibility followed. Substance-related distress. There had been instability in the household tied to alcohol and illegal substance use, not directly attributed to Hannah, but present in her environment. Investigators examined whether exposure to that tension, combined with emotional fatigue, could have contributed to a sudden, irreversible decision. It was logical. It fit the message. It aligned with known stresses. But then, small inconsistencies began to surface. The physical findings did not fully support a self-inflicted death. The location of the body, the nature of the injuries, these details required closer examination. Forensic analysis does not rely on narrative. It tests it. And the message itself began to raise questions. The wording was close to Hannah's voice, but not exact. The timing felt deliberate. Positioned. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, the initial explanation started to lose its weight. What had seemed like a complete story began to show gaps. Because in cases like this, the first narrative often arrives early. But it rarely survives the evidence. The truth did not surface all at once. It came in layers, distance, fire, and what the body revealed. In the early hours of April 5, 2024, around 2:30 a.m., Hannah McGuire was killed inside the bathroom of her home in Sebastopol. The space showed little disruption. No broken fixtures. No visible struggle. But pathology would later confirm the cause: strangulation. Controlled force. Sustained. After the killing, the scene was reset. Her body was moved. Investigators later reconstructed the next phase through timelines and admissions. Hannah's body was placed into her vehicle, a Mitsubishi Triton. Not in the trunk. In the footwell. Compressed, concealed, positioned for transport. From Sebastopol to Scarsdale, the distance is approximately 20 kilometers, about a 25-minute drive along rural roads, with minimal traffic at that hour. No checkpoints. No witnesses required. The route is direct, quiet, and familiar to locals. Sometime before dawn, the vehicle reached remote bushland outside Scarsdale. Then the fire. Emergency services would later respond to the burned vehicle. By the time it was extinguished, the exterior was blackened, the interior heavily damaged. But fire does not erase everything. It distorts. It preserves in fragments. Inside, forensic teams located human remains. Despite thermal damage, examiners determined the body belonged to Hannah McGuire. Burn patterns indicated the fire occurred after death. There was no evidence she was alive when the vehicle was ignited. Back in Sebastopol, the original scene told a quieter story, one of absence rather than violence. Then came the digital layer. As he left the scene, Young used McGuire's phone to send messages to her mother, Debbie, claiming she was going to take her life. He then transferred $2,000 from McGuire's bank account to her mother and $5,000 to himself. The timing did not align with voluntary action. 8 days into the trial in July 2025, after evidence had been presented step by step, Young changed his plea. He admitted what the forensics had already established. The sequence was no longer theory. It was confirmed. The investigation did not begin with a suspect. It narrowed. First came proximity. Lachlan James Young was the last known person to see Hannah McGuire alive. He lived with her. He knew her routines. When detectives mapped her final hours, his presence was constant, not incidental. Then came motive. Witness statements and prior records showed a relationship under strain, arguments, control, and a recent intervention order taken out by Hannah. She had been planning to leave. That shift, loss of control, became central. Next was behavior. After Hannah was reported missing, Young remained outwardly cooperative. But investigators noted timing gaps. His account of the night lacked precision. Key details shifted under repetition. His responses tracked the questions too closely. Then the evidence aligned. Phone data placed him active during the window he claimed to be asleep. Financial transfers from Hannah's account led directly to him, originated from devices under his control. Vehicle movement traced a route consistent with the burn site in Scarsdale. At that point, the pattern was no longer circumstantial. It was cumulative. Young was arrested and charged with murder. The case had moved from uncertainty to focus, not through accusation, but through convergence. The case reached court in July 2025. At first, Lachlan James Young pleaded not guilty. Proceedings began in the Supreme Court, with prosecutors laying out a structured case, timeline, forensic evidence, digital records, and financial activity after Hannah McGuire's death. 8 days into the trial, the direction changed. Faced with the weight of evidence, Young entered a guilty plea to murder. The court no longer needed to decide if he was responsible, but why and how the law would respond. Prosecutors described a controlled act followed by deliberate concealment, strangulation inside the home, transport of the body, destruction of evidence, and staged messages. The sequence showed awareness, not confusion. The defense pointed to his history, substance abuse, instability, failed treatment attempts. They argued diminished judgment, not absence of responsibility. The court considered both. Psychological assessments presented during sentencing did not remove intent. They framed it. Patterns of control, dependency, and escalation were noted, behavior that intensified as Hannah moved toward independence. In November 2025, sentencing was delivered. 28 years in prison. A non-parole period of 22 years and 4 months. No ambiguity. The court recognized the planning, the deception, and the breach of trust at the center of the crime. Because this was not an attack by a stranger. It was carried out by the person closest to her. That is the final truth the case leaves behind. Violence like this rarely appears without warning. It builds, through control, isolation, and silence. And the lesson is direct. When someone begins to take back control of their life, that moment, leaving, can also become the most dangerous.